Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Industry Needs by Borough, the state of Queens. My name is Annie Garniva, and I am the Vice President of Policy and Special Initiatives of the New York City Employment and Training Coalition. Thank you to all of the members that have joined us this afternoon, and a special thank you to LinkedIn and Ponce Bank for sponsoring the series. Today, in this first installment of our four-part Industry Needs series, we'll be discussing the state of Queens and strategize on measures being taken to keep businesses open and workers employed. We have partnered with the Queens Economic Development Corporation to bring you this event. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Seth Bornstein, Executive Director of Queens Economic Development Corporation, Thomas Grech, President and CEO of the Queens Chamber of Commerce, Hope Knight, President and CEO of Jamaica Development Corporation, Elizabeth Lusskin, President of Long Island City Partnership, and James Parrott, the Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School. NYC ETC supports the workforce development community to ensure that every New Yorker has access to the skills, training, and education needed to thrive in the local economy, and that every business is able to maintain a highly skilled workforce. NYC-ETC's membership is composed of 180 workforce providers, education institutions, and labor management organizations that provide job training and employment services to nearly 600,000 New Yorkers. Before we get started, all participants should know that you will be muted for the duration of this webinar. I'll be moderating a discussion with our speakers and discuss the state of their communities and what else can be done to keep businesses open and get Queens workers employed. We'll start off with James Parrott, who is the Director of the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School and Senior Fellow at NYC-ETC, who will provide a labor update on the Borough of Queens. James? If you give us 1 second, we're just going to have
the
presentation come up.
Thank you,
So
Annie.
James, over to you.
Okay. James Parrott, I'm with the Center for New York City Affairs, and I'm going to briefly overview some employment numbers on Queens and New York City to help set the context for today's discussion. So I'll try and keep that to about 10 minutes. And I think we can make the slides available so that people don't have to rush and take notes. There are some tables that have a lot of numbers on it. So you know, if you want to inspect that more carefully, you can do that later. If I could have the next slide, just to just an overview of what I want to cover. Obviously, I want to talk about how the COVID-19 economic dislocation is different from usual business cycle downturn, look at how Queens jobs and Queens residents have been affected, which workers were affected, talk about some of the ways in which the pandemic has reshaped the city's economy and its jobs, and then what the implications for all of this are for the ability of the labor market in Queens and the city to recover. In the next slide, you can see the employment trend over the last 15 months, going back to March of last year. The blue line represents New York City overall. The black line at the top is the US. So it's very clear from this chart, you know, when you look at the trajectory month by month, New York City was hit much harder in terms of the employment impact, and our recovery, you know, has been a little bit slower than at the national level. At this point, we've gained back about 45% of the jobs that we lost between February and March of last year. The U.S. recovery has been about 70%. And of course, they've recovered a greater share of a smaller job loss than New York City. As of May, the latest data we have, New York City's employment level was still almost 11% below where it was before the pandemic. That's nearly 3 times the 3.7% rate at the national level. You might notice here also the yellow line, which represents the rest of New York State. The orange line is New York State. And then if you separate out the rest of the state, New York and New York City, the rest of the state is they've rebounded more, and they're close to back to the national level at this point with about a 5% employment decline overall. If I could have the next slide, please. So needless to say, the job decline in New York City has been much greater than in other cities. We show here the 20 largest cities in the United States. This is data through April. So the US and the New York City declines are a little steeper than in the previous chart, which looked at May data. There was some continued growth in May, obviously. But so these numbers don't change that much from month to month. But New York City hit much harder than the rest of the nation, and some cities in the South actually experiencing much milder, more shallow declines than the nation overall. The next slide shows all of the gritty detail for New York City by sector, by industry in the economy. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but a couple of things are worth understanding. I've grouped the industries into three categories, which I think are useful to understand the unique effect of the pandemic as opposed to a usual business cycle downturn. So we have essential industries, which I think everybody understands: healthcare, social assistance, and government. The face-to-face industry category. So these are primarily the service industries hardest hit by the pandemic-related business restrictions. This includes the hospitality sector, obviously, transportation, airports, which are really important in Queens, as well as retail trade, and industries like construction and manufacturing, which can't be done remotely. So they're not service industries, but they are industries where the work doesn't get done unless the workers are at the factory or on the construction site. And of course, the proportionate decline in the face-to-face industries has been the greatest. The third category is the remote working. So these are the industries generally higher paid industries: finance and insurance, information, professional services, and so on. These industries have been not hit nearly as hard. So from February of 20 through last month, May, the decline in remote working had been a 6% employment decline. In essential industries, the decline is now down to only 3%. There was some initial job loss, doctors' offices and home health care and so on. Most of that has been made up at this point. So the pandemic to date effect in the essential industry in terms of the aggregate employment level is pretty moderated, but still a 20% fall off in face-to-face. Keep in mind, in a usual business cycle downturn, a 4 or 5% employment decline is pretty severe. That's what we call, a real recession. And a great recession can be anything over 5% decline. We are still 15 months later, 20% decline in the face-to-face industries. So all of this is citywide. And our total employment shortfall at this point is 510,000 compared to February of last year. The next chart looks at the same set of industries for Queens. Now, this data only goes through September of last year because this more detailed employment data is only available with some lag from the Labor Department. But September is a reasonable time period to look at because it obviously reflects the steep decline through April and some rebound, sort of a partial rebound. There was not significant job growth between September and January of this year. Since January, we've seen about 40 to 50,000 jobs a month added back in New York City overall. So that's brightened the outlook certainly. But as of September, the city overall had lost about 15.7% of private sector jobs. In Queens, not quite as severe, but still a 13.9% decline. The shaded industries here, the industries hardest hit, with over 20% employment declines. Arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, food services, other services, those have been hit, very hard citywide. Transportation has been hit harder in Queens because the airports account for a substantial portion of this 70,000 pre-pandemic employment level in the transportation sector. Next slide, please. So in thinking in terms of these three categories, before the pandemic, the face-to-face industries accounted for about 50% of all employment. Essential industries, healthcare is large in Queens. Social services, government has a significant presence in Queens. So all of that is about 41%. But look at the share of job losses. So face-to-face industries, 50% share of employment before the pandemic, but 80% of the job losses. Remote working industries, a proportionate decline, 8% of the job losses, 9% of the pre-pandemic employment. Essential industries, not hit as hard in terms of job losses, but of course, this is a sector where many workers were required to keep working at some significant health risks. So the workers were put through an unprecedented ordeal, even if they didn't lose their jobs. So we need to keep that in mind. In the next slide, we'll see here that, so it's not surprising, given that the pandemic has had, a concentrated impact on tourism, on hospitality jobs, on local retail and services, and the building services industry, because particularly in Manhattan, 1.2 million office workers largely not working in their offices over the past year. So that's taken away a lot of the daily foot traffic that supports a lot of restaurants and coffee shops and bars after work and entertainment and local retailing and so on. So Manhattan has borne the brunt of the job loss, although right after that, Queens and Brooklyn, each have lost, as of September again, about 80,000 jobs. And then the next chart is a bar chart that shows the percentage decline. And again, so Manhattan hit harder. Queens, seeing a 13.9% decline. Again, a Great Recession is 5 or 6% employment decline. This is many times worse than that. Next slide. It's fairly well understood by this point that the workers in New York who have borne the brunt of this job loss concentrated in the face-to-face service industries are heavily workers of color, less educated, more likely to be immigrant, a lot of younger workers, and lower paid workers. Most of these jobs are jobs where you get paid by the hour. If you don't work, you don't get paid. Whereas in the remote working sector, a lot of people are on annual salaries, and of course they have been able to keep working, but on a remote basis. So this chart just shows the greater likelihood of someone with less education or young workers being displaced than other segments within that demographic. And we're going to look at in a minute about some Queens specific data on this. Next slide. So I want to address this question of, that's come up a lot about labor shortage at this point, which is really paradoxical given the huge number of people who lost jobs. Why is it so hard to recruit people back to work? There's no easy answers in this. Clearly, we've been through a really unsettled time, in this country, a very unsettled labor market. What we're also witnessing, which is part of this labor shortage, is that there's a record number of quit rates, especially in the hospitality and restaurant industry in particular. These are pretty low paying jobs in New York City. There's because there's a provision for a tip credit that goes toward the minimum wage. The minimum cash payment for the minimum wage in restaurants is $10 an hour. So a lot of workers are, using the occasion of being out of work for so long, seeing industries like restaurants being very volatile and so on. They're rethinking what their career positions are. And of course, the workforce in restaurants is very heterogeneous, so it's hard to generalize about that workforce. Some workers certainly have been challenged by the lack of affordable childcare. That was a big problem even before the pandemic. Lingering concerns about encountering people who are unvaccinated. You don't know who's vaccinated and who's not. New York State also has a partial unemployment system that makes it unduly complicated. It's much more problematic than in any other state in the country in terms of trying to determine whether it or not it makes sense to go back to work on a part-time basis. You have to weigh that against what portion of your unemployment benefits are going to be reduced when you return to work. It should have been fixed a long time ago. It has been fixed now. The fix is just hasn't been implemented yet. Next slide. So looking at Queens, Queens residents. So up to this point, we've been looking at jobs in Queens. So now we're going to shift and talk about people who live in Queens. So of course, a lot of people who live in Queens might have those face-to-face jobs in Manhattan. So they're out of luck just the same, even though the job decline in Queens has not been as great as Manhattan. Queens residents are heavily employed in the face-to-face industry. So 54%, you recall from the earlier slide that 50% of the jobs in Queens were face-to-face. Next slide, please. So here's some demographic data on Queens residents. So you can see that, and this is by these three categories, essential, face-to-face, and remote working. You can see that a very high proportion of persons of color in Queens, particularly in essential and face-to-face industries, high proportion, less than a four-year college degree, very high proportion of foreign-born relative to the other boroughs and to the city overall, and also a very high proportion of low-income workers. Next slide. Now, there are lots of problems, lots of challenges in the labor market beyond just the sheer number of jobs that we lost. A lot of workers, in fact, over 500,000 New York City workers have been unemployed for over 6 months, 26 weeks. That's considered long-term unemployment. And economists know lots of bad things happen when workers are unemployed, out of work for that long a period of time. We now have several 100,000 people who have been unemployed for more than a year. So lots of problems in terms of how you get people who have been unemployed for that long back into the workforce. A lot of people are back to work. Of those who are back to work, a lot of people are working part-time, even though they would prefer to have full-time work, but their employer only has enough business at this point to employ them on part-time people. And as I've said before, a lot of parents, particularly women, are kept out of the labor force by caregiving responsibilities and child rearing, and also the lack of affordable and accessible childcare, and clearly continuing concerns about health risk. I just have a couple more slides and then I'll wrap up. Next slide. So we worked with the Consortium for Worker Education on an in-depth survey of over 725 residents of Astoria in Queens, and some interesting highlights of that, which help give us a little more insight into how the pandemic has been playing out. So we found that a third of the respondents had been furloughed or laid off, and another 35% lost hours in pay. 39% of Black workers were dislocated, 34% of Latinx workers, more than 3/4 of households with incomes below 50,000 lost jobs or pay. Freelancers were more likely to be displaced, that is, to lose all work, than payroll workers. Of those, as of February, who had returned to work, only a third were working full-time, 2/3 working part-time. And here's a really interesting finding. Only 42% of people who were dislocated expected to return to work with the same employer. Their employer might have gone out of business, or that industry's, is not going to come all the way back anytime soon, and so on. 20% expect to have to find work in a new occupation or industry. This is a lot of labor market change in a short period of time. We've never seen anything like this before. Next slide. So when are we going to recover the total number of jobs that we had before the pandemic? According to a recent updated forecast from the city's independent budget office, it will be until 2024 before we get back to the February 2020 employment level. We're in the midst of recovering jobs each month. I said before, we're gaining back 40 to 50,000 jobs a month right now. We expect that to continue, but we will still, at the end of this year and at the end of next year, in fact, still be far short of where we were before. Tourism is not going to rebound that fast. Some businesses have gone out. We've seen some new businesses form, but not on a scale to offset the ones that we've lost, and so on. The economy is recovering. I think fundamentally, New York City's economy is strong, but we have a serious labor market challenge. Next slide. And this gives you some idea of that. So this looks at the last 4 business cycles, and you can see that this charts the employment level from the peak, and then you see it dip down in the downturn, and then you see the recovery period from that. The last few downturns, it's taken us, it takes us, at least 38 months to reach the previous peak employment level. Of these 3 previous downturns, the steepest employment decline was the early 90s, when we lost 10% of jobs. We lost 20% of jobs this time, as of last April. We've gained back some of that, but the experience of previous economic downturns is that the recovery is very slow. Next slide. So the key takeaways from this is that the pandemic economic effects are different than a business cycle downturn. Job displacement has been greater in New York City than other cities. Queens jobs and residents have both been heavily affected. And fundamentally, we're facing significant reemployment challenges due to long-term unemployed, the slow recovery in hospitality and related industries, and an acceleration of certain pre-pandemic trends, like the increased use of technology, the increased increased incidence of e-commerce, and how that's undermined brick and mortar retailing. We face a greater labor market. What we need is a greater labor market intervention in the form of workforce development assistance and expanded training to reconnect long-term dislocated workers, permanently dislocated workers, equip them if they need new skills to get some of the jobs that will be expanding in the next few years in New York City. And if we don't do this, then we're at risk of losing the substantial economic gains that were achieved by a lot of low-income New Yorkers between 2013 and 19, when we saw the strongest wage and income gains for people on the bottom half of the income spectrum since the 1960s. That's a long period of time. Those were substantial gains. That achievement is at risk now if we don't make sure that we have a speedy recovery. And I think we're going to need a greater degree of labor market intervention to get there. So I'm sorry I ran over a little bit, but let me stop.
Thanks, James. All super informative stuff, and definitely really, if we haven't understood just how deep of a hole we're in, this is definitely clears it up. And I find especially the elements about low-income workers being hardest hit, I think, is a statistic that is often overlooked. Really kind of magnifies another reason as to why we need to be pushing for high growth jobs, high wage jobs as a form of stability. So super appreciate your perspective and sharing that with us today. And so we'll use some of that information to move forward with our panel conversation and really gain perspectives from the business communities on the ground, really having these hard conversations with businesses. So I'll introduce our speakers who are incredible individuals leading innovative work in the business community. We have Seth Bornstein, Executive Director of the Queens Economic Development Corporation. We have Thomas Grech, President and CEO of the Queens Chamber of Commerce. Hope Knight, President and CEO of the Jamaica Development Corporation. And Elizabeth Lusskin, who's the President of the Long Island City Partnership. Thank you all for being with us on this lovely afternoon, and really looking forward to an informative and illuminating conversation and how we can kind of start working more closely together and how we can learn from you from the workforce side. So if you could each take a minute to introduce yourself, your organization, and your role in the Queens business community. We'll start off in alphabetical order. So Seth, why don't you kick us off?
Thank you, Annie, and welcome. It's good to see my fellow economic development professionals here in Queens. We see each other on Zoom a lot, so hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. Thank you for having me here. Queens Economic Development is 44 years old, 45 next year. We are the borough-wide economic development agency. Our focus is helping people start and grow their small business. And our emphasis is for those of low and moderate income, women, immigrants, minorities. That's our world, from giving them individual assistance to classes and workshops. We also do tourism in Queens, started that about 7 years ago, big time, and it's made a difference, and obviously it's taken a real hit this year. We operate the entrepreneur space food incubator in Long Island City, helps small food businesses. And with that capacity, I'm not just the director of an EDC, but I run a small business in Long Island City. So I sort of see both sides sometimes. And the last year and a half has been complicated for everybody because of that saying. So, what to James' last point of intervention is really key, and look forward to working with all of you on that. We'll go on, I guess, to introductions.
Thanks, Seth. Yes, Tom, if you could introduce yourself and just give us a bit of an idea of your work.
Good afternoon, Queens. Good afternoon, New York, and my colleagues in business and workforce development. Tom Grech, Queens Chamber of Commerce. We just came off our celebration for our 110th year at the Queens Chamber of Commerce. I'm winding up my 6th year here in the next few weeks, and it has been a crazy, hellacious, wild year, which everybody knows already, but sometimes the depths of it are still to be explained. I think James did a really good job of talking about some of the damage that's out there, and I look forward to hearing from my friends and peers in all things business and workforce in Queens coming up next. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Tom. And Hope?
Yes, hi. Happy to join my partners in crime in Queens here today at this panel. I am Hope Knight, Greater Jamaica Development Corporation, an organization that is about 52 years old, with the mission to expand the local economy of downtown Jamaica and Southeast Queens. We look to advance development around mixed income residential projects, hotels that support visitor traffic, and expanding retail in the region. So much of our dollars get siphoned off to over the border in Nassau County, so really focused on developing a vibrant retail corridor. We also manage the industrial business zone in Southeast Queens, and we are a CDFI and have a revolving loan fund.
Thanks, Hope. And Liz?
Hi, thank you. And it is great to be here with you, Annie, and with everyone else on the panel. I say we've been around over 40 years, and it's an impressive statistic, but we're the kid, I guess, of everybody in this panel. So we've just been around 41 years, but we're the local development corporation for the Long Island City area, which is a city within New York City that encompasses every kind of business, every kind of residential, every kind of mode of transportation, you name it, right on the western border of Queens. Our work is grounded in business assistance, so one-on-one help with everything, as we joke, from financing to fire hydrants, but also finding employees. We are not a workforce training or workforce development provider, but we do a lot of connecting people with those who are. We also do long-range economic planning and other similar kinds of things here. And about 5 years ago had done a comprehensive look across the business landscape of Long Island City, and it really determined that there were a lot of great jobs that one did not need a lot of higher education or advanced training for, but there was a disconnect with the local population of folks who would benefit from those jobs, and that these jobs were often overlooked because they were not in the high growth sectors of let's say, healthcare. And so we've done work with our partners to try and bridge that gap and help educate people about the opportunities that are there. Obviously, the last year has been crazy and extremely uneven, and we'll talk more about that later. But I think that the topics that we're addressing today and the way James ended his talk is exactly right. This is an urgent issue. If we don't address the employability, the connections to employment, the access to opportunity, we are not going to have a recovery that benefits all of New Yorkers and all of New York. And so it's important to take stock of these things right now.
Thanks, Liz. So happy to have all of you here today. So with all of this in mind, what is your reaction to the Queens labor update that James provided? How has the pandemic affected the business and workforce landscape in Queens, especially from your vantage point? And how have your organizations adapted during and after the pandemic? So let's go backwards. Liz, why don't you kick us off?
Okay. Definitely, it all made sense what James was saying, and I think that a couple of key statistics in there, not only the uneven impact within Queens of certain sectors, but also the fact that Queensians are the people who do all the jobs that both are the essential workers throughout New York City, but also are in the forward-facing, the front-facing industries, the building workers, the construction workers, et cetera. So the job losses in Manhattan are really, in many cases, the job losses of Queens people. We have seen, there were some businesses that were manufacturing essential equipment, managed to stay strong throughout, but they're now facing terrible supply chain issues and labor issues. So they can't get raw materials to fulfill the orders that they have, and they can't bring back enough people to fill the positions that they need to be able to fulfill those orders. Huge number of businesses in Long Island City that are involved in all aspects of the hospitality industry, whether that's a restaurant or a caterer or a hotel or an events company or a musician, all just absolutely devastated, of course. Starting to come back a bit, the restaurants, of course, a bit more than others, but even there, they can't do lunch service because they can't get enough staff, even though the people are back now to have lunch. And if you're a caterer, yes, people are having, 30 to 100 person weddings, but that's not the 500 person, $500 a plate gala that you were catering, that you had 6 of those lined up in the week that the world was shut down in last March. And sort of everything in between. Office is starting to come back. But, again, that's going to take time, and all of the businesses that depend on office are scrambling to kind of, stay afloat. Nobody's really fully back, right? And I'm sure we'll get into more of the issues, but James's report was absolutely spot on in so much.
Thanks, Liz. Hope, you want to jump in here?
Sure. So I, agree with all of what Liz said, and I want to focus my comments around the airport. The Southeast Queens economy is inextricably tied to JFK Airport. And, with travel going to near zero, very hit our community very hard. Many workers at the airport live in Southeast Queens. So travel is coming back and coming back a little stronger than was predicted, but it is still in the process of coming back. And like Liz said, around logistics with respect to industrial manufacturing companies, it takes a little bit of time for the airlines to get back. I think some of you've heard some of the airlines had to cancel a bunch of flights because they didn't have the personnel that were ready to go and retrain to get back into the air. And so, I've been told that we're not going to see, the airlines back in full course until the fall. And there will be, even another bill towards getting back to full schedule. And so that definitely impacts, the workers at the airport and their ability to get back to work. The good news is that there is a JFK expansion project. That project will probably be scaled back, but it will go forward nonetheless. And there will be opportunities for employment, additional employment in those projects. And Greater Jamaica is working with the Port Authority to design training with the employers to specifically create outreach to the Southeast Queens community.
Great. Tom?
Thanks very much. A couple comments about the landscape in general. I just got back from being out. I try to get out and walk the streets at least 3 days a week to see what's going on. My staff is great at telling me what's going on with all their outreach. We added a bunch of people during the COVID to go out and do outreach. But at the end of the day, I just came back being out with council member Robert Holden on Fresh Pond Road and also on 69th in Maspeth. And I always ask this question in an open-ended way, not fishing for the right answer that I want to hear, but about getting people. And so I take a little bit of exception with Mr. Parrott's comments about some of the reasons why people are not going back to work. From what I hear from the folks that own the small businesses that ask their people, why can't I get you to come back? Invariably, it has to do with the federal stimulus and the additional funding. People don't want to admit that in lots of cases. It's almost like a dirty thing to say, but I've got to say it, right? Because the extra couple $100 a week adds up to about $1,200 a month. And people are just comfortable now. School is out, their kids are home, or school's almost out, and the kids will be home. And the comfort of staying in their apartment or their home and not working is bigger than the need or the pull to go back and help the small business that you work for years in some cases. And many of those positions are not high skill positions, right? But at the end of the day, I'm hearing stories, and the ones I'm hearing are anecdotal about, people in back of the restaurant jobs getting $25 to $30 an hour to wash dishes. That is unsustainable. And some other of my friends tell me that's because those jobs pay too little, but you can't really charge in Queens $20 for a hamburger, right? Or nachos at a small mom and pop restaurant. So I think there'll be an equilibrium point where as more people come back to work, the labor market won't be so tight. But right now it's bad, and it's kind of getting worse because those benefits expire, I believe it's September 1st, and it's a challenging environment. The other part about raw materials, which is interesting, is we did a ribbon cutting for the Home Depot in Maspeth, and a sheet of plywood goes, and this is just basic nuts and bolts, but a basic sheet of plywood before the pandemic was $20 a sheet, 4x8 sheet of plywood, and today it's $80. So no matter how you slice it up, and whether it was a supply chain issue, whether the mills couldn't get people to go mill the wood, it's 4 times the cost. And I'm hearing it about simple staples like chicken as well. But it's endemic. Again, it will go away over time. But the notion of getting people back to work is really, really important. After all these problems, the buying public wants to get out. They want to go to restaurants. When I walked up and down 69th, the restaurants on a Thursday at 11:30 in the morning were packed, and the lunch crowd was getting, was building up as well. And they can't open up fully. They don't have arms and legs and staff to serve those people.
Thanks, Tom. And Seth?
Thank you. I just want to start off. Those of us who work in this field and participating in listening to us, we all have faith in the city, and I realize if you reach some point in your career, it will come back. I mean, we've been through some really horrible times. Just in my lifetime, to look back at the history of the city, a couple hundred years have been worse times. So the city will come back. It's a matter of how it does and what we can do to make that, to accelerate that. To James' last point of intervention and what we could do, our role as an economic development agency, intervention to small businesses, help them so they can keep employees and bring back employees. And there's a lot of small, simple things that could be done that we need to be creative about, and we're trying to do. This year, retail, all neighborhood strips, if they weren't essential, they were dead. And everybody started ordering from Amazon. It was a real, embarrassing. We've ordered from Amazon. I hate when they do it, but we do that because it's easy. You don't want to go outside. So the hurt was there. The communities are really hit hard. Even the food businesses, some of them did very well and take it. A lot of them did. Because simple solution we figured out was everybody ordered their food online. You needed a picture of the food. Most of these folks in small businesses had no good pictures. They didn't know how to do it. We did a little program. I got a little money from somebody. We hired a photographer to take pictures of the cakes and the cookies in the bakery, and they used them on social media. All of a sudden, business got better because the cake looked attractive. It wasn't a kid taking a picture with their cell phone. So simple things. We have to think of more of those that are creative, easy to do, and rapid. And that's a really big part of bringing back the economy. James's report, which we participated in with the Consortium of Education, it was based on a story, but it really, it's reflective, I think, in the entire borough, all the issues here. Hope's point about the airline industry, aviation industry. We have estimated about 480,000 jobs in Queens, 100,000 related to the airport in some way. Speak to anybody in Queens, somebody who was a steward or, cargo or the hotel close by, Florence that caters, whatever it is. And, that business, it will come back at the time. How do we accelerate that? How do we get them to new markets? And as economic development organizations that work with businesses large and small, it's incumbent on us to really figure out ways to do that. So there can be small steps and big steps. They've got to be done rapidly to make things happen. And the city and the state and the feds and a number of programs, we've benefited from additional counselors, getting our small businesses involved to know the programs. I mean, one of the biggest hassles early on last year was PPP was great, but my Corona merchant spoke Spanish, barely know how to use a computer. How did he figure it out? I got a little deli in my incubator little city, All American Deli. Great guys, two cousins. They're busy working all the time in Spanish. They don't understand the system. And, we did one-on-one, we have Spanish-speaking staff, but, it's definitely throwing sand against the ocean. It's really hard to do that without a lot of other considered effort. But, I think overall it could work. And I do, Tom's point about the labor market. I understand what you're saying, Tom, and there's been a lot of discussion. People don't want to work because it's getting big money. I'm not so sure if that's entirely true. It's a lot anecdotal. I've yet to see real numbers on that because as an employer too, in the incubator, we hire people, we pay better than minimum wage. We always have. I want to keep people. I want them to grow in the field. And I think, sometimes we have to work it out, all of us. But sometimes there's a sense, people make money, they can sit home, why would they go to work? I don't think people want to sit home. They want to have a job, they want to have a career, they want to grow. And smaller businesses have to remember that. I mean, what's a good profit, what's not, what's unfair, what's fair to your workers. And I want to see more information on that because it's almost like a myth. This myth, people are sitting home. I'm not so sure if they want to. So I would have a spirited discussion with Councilman Holden you, Tom, at some point about that.
I would love that. I mean, listen, different opinions makes the world go round. I see it and I hear it from the businesses that we reach out to, but clearly small businesses need to be cognizant of what the employees need. But right now, in this point of time, I just see it more than not. But thanks for your commentary regarding that, Seth.
Thanks all. I mean, as always in life, the answer is probably a complicated combination of all of the above, somewhere in the middle. And a wide variety of lessons learned about kind of some shortfalls, and especially I think the small business community is probably faced with the biggest challenge of having the tightest margins and the biggest workforce skill needs. So switching over to that topic, how have Queens businesses shifted their talent approach during and post-pandemic? What trends in hiring practices have you noticed as businesses shift to? And of course, you know, we have a wide variety of workforce providers on the ground on with us today, so that's definitely top of mind for them. Hope, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So I'll build on something that Tom's talking about with respect to restaurants. So, you know, one of the things I've noticed with restaurants is they've had to kind of reframe their model. They have, some of the restaurants, and a number of them, have gone to no table service because they don't have servers to be able to service customers. And they've gone to disposable containers when eating in because they can't find dishwashers to you know, do the dishes, or they can't afford to pay the wages that would attract a dishwasher you know, at a small business. So, you know, what I'm seeing is that businesses are sort of reframing the way they do business. And I would imagine they may not go back to the way they did business before. So that'll be interesting, you know, with respect to the restaurant industry, particularly in a community like Jamaica and Southeast Queens, where you don't have, you know, kind of large number of white tablecloth restaurants.
And if I could just jump in on that issue, I think there's another thing particularly affecting restaurants. I think in general, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the fall, right? Like, so yes, big offices plan to return in the fall, but everybody's concerned about what's going to happen in the winter. So I think that there's some hesitancy to go back full bore on hiring and everything because you're concerned what's going to happen. But also on the other side for restaurants, in addition to all the uncertainty of the pandemic, there's been this regulatory uncertainty that has just repeated waves of, are we going to get to do outdoor dining? How long are we going to get to do outdoor dining? You know, okay, we get to do the takeaway drinks, but then that went away today. So all of these things, their business model is full of variables that they have no control over and that are totally unpredictable and that change very rapidly. So the investments that people have to make in things like an outdoor structure or in bringing back employees, it's very hard to know, especially since you're really not sure what your customer basis is going to be yet. So it's just this vast uncertainty, which I think does make all kinds of investments, whether it's in human beings or in infrastructure or in supplies, very tricky thing to do, let alone the fact that you may not have the capital to do that because you burned through whatever extra capital you had, and your relief was largely geared towards paying for your employees.
Thanks, Liz. And Tom, would you be able to kind of cover more of the talent acquisition approach question? So what you've been seeing about people shifting and how we can think about trends and practices that businesses have been doing to either train up employees or what the kind of talent that they're looking for in this more complicated environment.
Yes, I mean, we know that there's about 6,000 restaurants in Queens County. It's somewhere around that number. We also believe that there's probably about 1,000 that have folded over the course of the last 14, 15 months. That's the bad news. The good news is many of them are being reinvigorated by landlords that are being more realistic and cutting the rent for a place they might have had that had a restaurant with a kitchen established. And so we've been to a number of ribbon cuttings over the last couple of weeks where folks are just jumping in from one cuisine to another in a facility to get that that new business back up and running. So despite everything else, the American dream is still alive in many, many corners of our city, and I think especially in Queens. But I will tell you that the folks that did lose their jobs, the waiters, the busboys, lots of those folks in general, they don't need to be like workforce trained. It's almost like a reskilling. Many of them don't have English as a language with any kind of real ability to converse or speak in English. And even things like the GED, some of them don't have the education. Now, clearly we can't, at least at the initial steps, get folks that have those limited skills and abilities become coders on a tech segment, right? But the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So I think we, as folks that kind of represent and run the business community in Queens County, including your organization, Annie, you and Joey, have an obligation, a moral obligation, to think about reskilling and or retraining those folks for the jobs of tomorrow. I read a great stat with the whole convergence of digital, and this was a story that came out of the Wall Street Journal before the pandemic. There's like 2.4 million cashiers in our country, 2.4 million. With or without the pandemic, those jobs generally go away. You go to any like large retailer, even some of the smaller ones, they have optional self-checkout. And I think that's going to be the future. The folks that do those jobs need to be reskilled and retrained for other jobs. And I would argue, in order to be more relevant, they need to be more customer service focused and more customer savvy. So those are the kind of folks that might have dealt with the general public in the past with, as a cashier, need to be doing different tasks in the same environment, but with different skills.
Well, hopefully the council and mayor will rise to the occasion and we'll be able to infuse the market with a bit more training and reskilling, to your point. Seth, you want to wrap up this part of the conversation?
Sure. Just said my colleagues have said very similar thoughts to what I have, because the idea of the retraining, we've always worked with our community colleges or high schools to do this, but now's a really good opportunity to really make it work and be expedient about it. I've worked with CUNY and some of the high schools, and it's interesting. Some of the trade high schools in the city in Queens have been terrific training this. We've had interns from aviation and Robert Kennedy School for graphics, and super talented young people. So this is a chance to really work with them to see how we can build on the future, because that's where it's going to be at.
Couldn't agree more. So we'll just have one more question go, and then we'll wrap up and go into our member strategy sessions. So what practices have you noticed businesses adapt to enhance their relationships with workforce development providers? What can workforce development providers do to enhance effective relationships with businesses and employers? So why don't we kick it off with Seth?
Okay. I think in a lot of the businesses I work with, I have no clue who workforce development providers are, to be honest. They don't. And I think partially I work with the smaller businesses, not the bigger ones. They're busy running the business. If there can be ways to outreach to them, we, as all of us, work with our communities, we could be the interface, the intermediary. That's the first. Let them know what's available and how they can do it, and to make it easy for them to do. When you're running the camera, the bakery, the deli, the shoe store, it's, especially now, it's 24/7 in your mind. Anything else is extraneous. So making, and it's incumbent on us as the local group that knows them to let them know it's available. So let us know what your services are, so we can really bring the partners together.
Thanks, Seth. And Hope, your thoughts on how workforce providers can better support businesses?
Absolutely. So this is one very specific example. We have a business that, employs about 50 people. So, a small business, but a decent sized business. And they're having trouble recruiting. And one of my staff people asked, well, what's the job description? And this person sort of explained, said, well, do you have a job spec? Like, no, we don't do that. We didn't have to do that. We never had to put together specs. We get somebody's, cousin or brother, and that's how we hired before. So I would say, to the extent that you could help as a workforce provider, small business, put together, job specs to help them think about, what it is exactly they're hiring for. I think that's the sort of support and technical assistance that they can really use to kind of build their businesses.
That's a really great point. Not really one I've heard before, so thank you for that. And Tom, what about you?
So a couple things there. Hope is spot on. You know, across the city of New York, all 5 chambers have bonded together over this period of time. We always are pretty close, but we kind of got joined at the hip. And I will tell you that across the city of New York, 90% of our membership has 10 or fewer employees in general. So while the big boys, you know, on occasion pay the bills, our bread and butter and our reason for being are the small mom and pops. And they do not have an HR department, to Hope's point about job descriptions. They don't have a legal department, and they don't have an accounting department. If I hear one more time, I couldn't get triple P because my brother-in-law couldn't figure out the system, I mean, that was a big part of the reason. Another one of those dirty little secrets about why things weren't getting done, because they didn't have access to even something close to professional support in those 3 key areas. Again, HR, legal, and accounting. We pride ourselves here, and I'm always willing to share the resources. Today, we speak 12 different languages at the Queens Chamber of Commerce, in-house, my staff. And so we're always out there trying to help people understand more clearly in their native language, the rules and regulations that are out there. And I think the more we can do to train people in some of the basics in their native language, while at the same time helping them get more acclimated to English related type of things is a win across the board. But again, those small businesses need the local support. The chambers now are lobbying the city to embed HR and legal certain resources in our chambers across the city, so that people don't struggle with, when I want to hire somebody, to Hope's point about, I asked my cousin and my brother, how much did you used to make? Have you ever been arrested? Like, those questions are forbidden. And the average person, if you violate that, it's significant. And, you know, the rules are the rules. And those are the kind of things that are really important for small businesses, any businesses, to avoid. But the little guys and gals don't have those resources.
And Liz, can you close us out? Thoughts on workforce providers better supporting businesses?
Sure. So much I could say, but I think pulling on something that Hope said and some other things, you know, it takes a village, right, for a successful placement of somebody in a company. And again, the kind of companies that we're talking about, it may be 50, it may be 200 people, but they are companies where the owner of the company is very intimately involved with every aspect of it. So if the placement doesn't work out well, they're feeling the pain, right? They didn't hand it off to somebody else and say, you deal with them, they're dealing with them. And the reason why there's such a reliance on cousins and uncles and best friends is because they come with a village. And the workforce development provider can be the village. And the best workforce providers and the best relationships with the business are when that provider stays there through the training period and is that village and is the one who makes sure the person is showing up for work every day on time. And if they can't, they call in and is following up on the things they're supposed to follow up on. And then eventually that person launches, right? And they can operate on their own. But if be the village is I guess the key thing, and it's what the employers, it gives the employers the comfort level to work with you as a workforce provider, because they feel like it's a joint venture and you're both sides are equally invested in the success of the placement and of the person in the job.
Thank you, Liz. Yes, we hear that all the time, that unfortunately the workforce system writ large is just not created to best support small and medium-sized businesses. And so really part of the aspect that we're pushing for a recovery is to finally kind of make that happen and emphasize that small businesses really are the engine of our economy, and nothing has highlighted that more than the pandemic. So super appreciate all of you being on with us. It's been a really illuminating conversation, and we look forward to partnering with all of you as we move forward, and hopefully some more funds get opened up for all of this collaboration to be happening on the ground. Thank you. And we're now going to conclude this portion of the event. Thank you so much again for your expertise and perspectives and sharing with our members and partners today. We appreciate you taking